Good evening, everyone. If you'd like to follow along tonight, I'd encourage you to open up your Bibles to Job chapter 39. Job chapter 39. Previously, we had been talking about God showing up and asking Job a series of questions. And so God's first questions that he led with were questions about nature and creation. There were several notable things in there, one of those being the water cycle, which we're all getting another lesson on tonight. And Job had no answers to the questions that God asked him. It was just God repeating different questions over and over again. And then, at the end of chapter 38 and into chapter 39, God started to transition to asking Job questions about animals. So he went from talking about creation of planets and stars and weather and large cosmic things to things that were a little bit maybe smaller in scale, a little bit more familiar or easier for Job perhaps to wrap his mind around. But with the point that Job still didn't have the scope of control that God had. Whereas Job, for example, may be able to look after one animal. He did not look after all the animals, right? And so that's kind of where we left off. And we left off in Job chapter 39 in verse 9. So let's go ahead and read Job chapter 39 and verse 9. It reads, "Will the wild bull be willing to serve you? Or will he spend the night at your feeding trough?" Okay? So will the wild bull be willing to serve you? Will he be willing to spend the night at your feeding trough? Now, thankfully, Matt had a lesson recently, just last Sunday, about the different translations. And so hopefully you were able to digest all that and listen to it. And so I'm going to do my best to call out some of those differences when we encounter them, because there are several here in Job. And this is another one where the NASB says wild bull and feeding trough. The King James Version says unicorn and crib. And the New King James Version says wild ox and manger. Now, when we were talking about deer, those translations felt pretty similar. Deer and hind, those are just two similar words for one another. But look at these. King James says unicorn. That seems pretty different than wild bull or wild ox, right? Wild bull, wild ox, we can maybe see how that fits together, right? But unicorn feels pretty different, right? And this is a great example of how words centuries ago, even in the English language, carried different meanings than the ones that they do today, right? When we talk about a unicorn today, we're picturing what? A horse with a big long horn on it, right? Something like that. That's the kind of mythology that we think of. Whereas in the King James Version, when they're talking about a unicorn, uni meaning one, right? They're simply talking about a creature that just has one connected horn. Right? So if you've seen a cow that it looks like the horns connect together and it just kind of almost sits on the top of its head, that's more of what they meant, right? And I did a little bit more digging into that because I still thought that was such an odd way to translate it. But, this is me thinking from the 20th century here. And some scholars think that what they were talking about was a type of cow called an oryx, okay? So if you're reading one of your Bible commentaries on the King James Version, it might say that they were talking about this creature called an oryx. So you can see an old-fashioned drawing of what an oryx looked like. And then that's not actually a real one. That's a fake model that someone has made of what they thought an oryx might look like. The last oryx died in Poland in the 1600s. So some believe this was what the wild bull was in chapter 39. So we don't know that for certain. But the bottom line is that in verse 30 or in verse 9 here in chapter 39, they're talking about some kind of cattle. They're not talking about a mythical unicorn the way that we think of today, right? Rick?
I actually read one thing on this. Now, this was just one idea.
Sure.
That possibly they were referring to a rhinoceros, which is
That could
not
be
really
too.
very tameable, and it's got one horn.
Yeah, and certainly that's another reasonable.
To me, but,
Yeah, absolutely. That's another reasonable assumption as well, right? I mean, if you think about, again, going back to Matt's lessons, how words change their meaning over time, right? Just a couple of verses up, we had talked about the wild donkeys, right? Now, what's the King James say? It says a wild ass, right? Well, how come we don't describe donkeys that way anymore? Well, that's kind of fallen out of style, right? Because that word has gathered other connotations and other meanings over time. And so it's become a rude word. And so as a result, we don't use that anymore, right? Because that word has developed new meanings in our modern day society. And so in the same way, we don't really use unicorn in that way because it's developed different meanings over hundreds of years, right? So we kind of stray away from that. Any questions on that verse there? Or any other comments or thoughts? Matt?
I did look this up, and the Hebrew word that underlies this is consistently 9 times, all 9 times that it occurs, it's in the King James Version, it's translated as unicorn.
Is it? That's interesting.
The other way.
Yeah. Did I miss anyone? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, now, when I think of a unicorn, the pictures that I have seen is
Mhm.
just like they have one straight horn up out of their head.
Yep.
Not what I would call a rack.
Right. So, and what I'm saying is that when we think of unicorn, we think of a horse with a horn, like a straight horn, right? And what they were thinking of here is, have you seen any kinds of species of cattle where it looks like their horn is almost connected? Like a lot of cows, their horns, it looks like it goes into their head, right? Like you have a horn coming out here and a horn coming out here. But for some, I think like longhorns, it looks like their horns are almost sitting on top of their head and connected is the way that it looks like, right? I actually think that the longhorn here in town has a fake mounted head. So next time you go there, check that out. And it looks like this cow has just a single connected horn that curves around, right? Pat?
Aren't some sheep, the rams, don't theirs kind of go together?
I think there are a couple that do that. Mm-hmm. Matt?
And from what I've studied, this goes with my previous lesson too. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, the word that the Greek language chose was very explicit at being what we would monokeros. It's this single.
Right.
And then the Latin picked that idea up, and so the King James Version was influenced by that tradition of that. So that explains a lot.
Yeah. I think the bottom line key takeaway that I want everyone to gather here is that the Bible wasn't talking about the fake, like, prancing pony mythology idea, right? And a lot of people get confused about that. God is very, very clearly taking Job through natural scientific things that he's created, right? And sometimes when people try and refute the Bible as just being, this is just a fun myth or whatever, maybe a fun moral story or something like that, they'll go to verses like that and show, and they'll say, oh, we'll see how out of touch the Bible is. And it says that there are unicorns, and we know that there aren't unicorns. And that's clearly not what was meant here. God is very clearly talking about some sort of either a cow or a sheep or perhaps a rhinoceros, but an actual living animal. And it just happens to be the language that scholars in the 1600s used to describe it. Rick?
Right. We have to notice from these verses as we go further along, he's just talking about an animal that they can't tame, that
Right.
we cannot tame and get it to do our work for us, and we can't trust it to do these things. So
Yeah.
there's a context thing here as well. So,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's great. That leads right into the next couple questions there in verse 10. As Rick said, it says, can you tie down the wild bull in a furrow with ropes? Or will he plow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because his strength is great and leave your labor to him? Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor? So this was just this idea of this powerful animal, which the way my personal interpretation is it's some kind of cow or ox. Would this animal obey you? Right? And that's the idea. Now, Job, he couldn't do that. He didn't say, oh, yes, God, I can do that, right? He didn't say that. Job couldn't. And one thing that I want to take away from this as well is, there are farmers that can tame cows, right? There are farmers that they have cattle and they have them do things. But Job didn't even have mastery over that animal. Job could have gone and gotten mastery over it, but he didn't have mastery over it, right? There was an opportunity in life. Job could have grown up and been a farmer and learned how to control a cow, but he hadn't. God, however, does have control of all animals. God's kind of pointing out, and we're going to see this, God's building up to this idea of who can contend with God, right? Why do you question or contend with me when I'm in control of everything? You can't even control this animal, Job. You could have gone out and learned how to control one, but you can't. You haven't spent your life learning in pursuit of that knowledge. You can't control this animal. If you can't even control that which is within your grasp, how can you oppose me or contend with me when everything is within my power, right? That's kind of the idea. This is what he's building up to. So let's keep that in the back of our minds as we move through that. Other thoughts or questions on the wild bull set of questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Rick.
As an example, though, don't we still have, not here, but in the world, there's still like wildebeest and all these wild cattle, right? Out in like Africa and stuff.
Yeah.
So that could be, like, to your point, could very easily be that type of animal.
Absolutely. Like more of a wild one. Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah. Now, this next set is kind of interesting because this isn't really a question, depending on the translation that you're reading. It's more of like God takes a moment in the middle of this questioning to just talk about an ostrich, to talk about the ostrich. And so we'll read that here. It says starting in verse 13, it says, "The wings of the ostrich flap joyously with the pinion and feathers of love." Now, again, this is one where there's a lot of different translations. So the NASB says, with the pinion, wings, and feathers of love. The King James Version says, goodly wings, unto a peacock's. And what that means, goodly wings, is like, it's got great wings, nice looking wings, right? Unto a peacock's is another way of saying, like a peacock has, right? We think of a peacock and it's got splendid wings and feathers, right? They're beautiful. And so all it's saying is it has splendid wings. They're beautiful. Like a peacock has beautiful wings, right? The New King James Version says wings and pinions like a kindly stork's. Like a stork has beautiful and graceful wings, right? The idea here, although they translate it slightly differently each time, is that this is a bird that has pretty and pleasing wings. That's kind of the key takeaway of this translation. But it says in verse 14, "For she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild animal may trample them. She treats her young cruelly as if they were not hers. Though her labor is for nothing, she is unconcerned, because God has made her forget wisdom and has not given her a share of understanding. When she rushes away on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider." So this is an interesting one to me because he's taking a moment to simply describe an animal rather than to question Job about it this time. And if you notice, he starts to talk about giving this ostrich wisdom. Now, we talked chapter ago about how God gives understanding to the mind, and he was talking about the human mind, right? So we already talked about the fact that God gives wisdom, and here he's talking about how he's withheld wisdom from this animal. There are plenty of animals in the world that we think of as smart or dumb, right? Think of some of the animals that you think of that are smart, right? I think that a lot of dogs tend to be smart. People say that dolphins and parrots and chimpanzees, mice are actually good at solving mazes and stuff like that. So there are a lot of smart, intelligent animals out there. And there are dumb ones too, right? The dodo was the prime example of a dumb animal, and it actually went extinct because it was too dumb to run away from people hunting it, and it got hunted to extinction, right? So people tend to use the dodo as an example of a dumb animal. Well, here God is telling us that he did not make the ostrich smart, which I think is just kind of an interesting verse. But why talk about an ostrich? Why stop his questioning of Job to stop and tell us this story about an ostrich? What do you think is the reason for that?
Maybe he thinks Job's a little dense.
It could be. That's a good answer. Maybe he thinks Job's a little dense, kind of drawing a parallel. Yeah?
You know, the phrase is, boy, he's as dumb as an ostrich.
Yeah. What else? Matt?
Well, verse 18 kind of tempers that whole thing about how it's stupid, right? It's like when she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and rider. So it's like this idea that she's not wise, she's not really protecting her eggs the way
Sure.
you think, but she's successful and happy and doing okay, and God's got it all under control.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? What do you think? Why do you think that God's talking about this ostrich all of a sudden? Rick?
He's the source of wisdom and knowledge, so he's saying he didn't give the ostrich any. And I think there's kind of a hint that I didn't have to give you any either, but I did, kind of a reverse thing.
Yeah.
Wisdom and understanding, that's two words that's used there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all those points, I think that they're all pretty valid here. God's expanding upon the depth of the designs that he has, right? This is just a simple animal. An ostrich isn't some amazingly smart and bright animal. And he's expanding on his design and showing how even with this pretty simplistic animal, as Matt said, he's got it all under control. He designed it this way. It's set up this way for a reason. He oversees this. He's very aware of how this works, right? It wasn't just that, well, that one slipped by my notice and ended up being stupid, right? This is a design and this is intentional. There's design in everything.
In my King James Version, in verse 13, it says, "Gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacocks?" He's asking Job, can you do that? The beauty of the peacock, when they spread their wings, the color, it's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And God has created them.
Mm-hmm.
So I do see a question here.
Yeah, and the King James is a little different from the others there because it does turn that into a question, whereas all the other versions have it as a statement. Matt?
Well, the ESV makes it a different question.
Oh, does it? I hadn't read that one.
It says, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love?
Right.
It's all a little different.
Yeah, I'm not an old English scholar, so I'm assuming that a lot of this stems from grammar, of trying to translate from another language, and it might be a little ambiguous in the source. But luckily, this is a case where it all adds up to the same idea. Rick?
There is looking at the Berean translation, it says it cannot match the pinions or feathers of the stork.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why it mentions a stork specifically, but anyway, nonetheless, it's talking about, like you were saying, God has made it incapable of certain things. It's not
Right.
very bright.
Yep.
It can't fly, but it can run. And it's
Right.
fast. And
Exactly.
it's good at that. So he's designed
Yeah.
it that way. So I think your point was right. And this is just another multiple translations, I think it may be a difficult piece.
Yeah, and we run into that a couple times where there's a word. Oftentimes, it is related to an animal, right? Where there's just not a lot of context for the translators at the time to really narrow down the exact meaning, and so they do their best, right? And so they do their best to translate it. But you see here, they're talking about the ostrich has these beautiful wings like this other beautiful bird, and some people think that it's translating to peacock. Others think it's translating to stork. But at the end of the day, would it matter which one? Right? It doesn't change the spiritual application of it, certainly, right? We're talking about, does the ostrich have beautiful wings like another beautiful bird? Yes. Right? No, you don't think so?
They're gray.
They're a little
love
study.
gray, but
Their studies.
Well, I suppose that's an aesthetic difference, but yeah.
If you was to have a peacock over here and you would have an ostrich over here, to me,
Just no competition?
no glamour whatsoever. I can't see that the ostrich has wings that
Well,
it's beautiful.
You know what? I have to say then, I'm glad that God sees the beauty in the ostrich, because then he can see the beauty in us sinful people as well, right? So, Matt.
Well, it kind of reminds me of some of the imagery in Song of Solomon, where
Yes.
he describes this woman and talks about her teeth are like, all these different animals, and coming out of the washing. And you imagine all these animals walking around, and it's like, that's not what we would just use to describe a beautiful woman. But that wasn't insulting in that culture, that perspective. Like, the lovely, the lovely teeth, that's nice. So it's probably one of those things that we're seeing it with different eyes.
Yeah, I would have to imagine that that's the case. So verse 18 we already went over. Verse 19. So now he's going to tell us about another animal. And in verse 19, he says, "Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane?" And again, depending on the translation, it either says mane or it says thunder, right? So if you're reading from the King James or the New King James, it says, "Do you clothe his neck with thunder?" The New American Standard says mane, right? So just asking these questions about the horse, right? Is Job the one that provides the horse with its appearance, right? No. Is he the one who gives the horse his might? No, right? Again, stressing that God is the creator and God has put the design into these things. And so then he asks us a couple other questions about a horse, right? He says in verse 20, "Do you make him leap like locusts? His majestic snorting is frightening. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the battle. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn his back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the flashing spear and the javelin." And again, there's a difference up here. So a couple versions say spear and javelin, others say spear and shield. Doesn't really change the overall message here, though. It says he races over the ground with a roar and fury, and he does not stand still when he hears the sound of the trumpet. As often as the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha," and senses the battle from afar, and the thunder of the captains and the war cry. And so God kind of gets more poetic again about this creation that he's made. You get this sense that God is pleased with his creations, right? These things he's made by design. And he's describing these wonderful things in poetry to Job. All the while, why is he telling this to Job? Why is he asking him these questions?
Just to drive home the point that he's God. And
Yeah.
Job is not, right? So he's in control of everything. He designed everything. Everything's working according to what he has said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and we'll finish these last few verses here and wrap up chapter 39. So he says in verse 26, "Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings towards the south? Is it at your command that the eagle flies high and makes his nest on high? He dwells and spends his nights on the cliff, on the rocky cliff, an inaccessible place. From there he tracks food. His eyes look at it from afar. His young ones also lick up blood greedily. Where the slain are, there he is." Right?
It
And-
almost seems like he's bragging.
It does, yes. And not in a bad way, right? Like he's God and he's done these wondrous things. And he's happy with them. He's pleased, right? What did Genesis say when God was done creating everything?
It was good.
It was good. It was very good. Yes, he was pleased with his creation. He liked it, right? And he's telling us about the pleasing creations that he's made, right? And so these are good things. So we went over a couple of these, again, all just stressing that Job didn't do that. And so that kind of brings us again to this question of thinking about the entire chapter. All these animal questions that God asked Job. Why did God ask Job these questions? What was the point of asking Job all about these animals?
Well, I think he asked about all these animals because he was the creator of all of those animals. And
Yep.
he was just telling Job, I'm the creator.
Mm-hmm.
You are just a man, whatever.
Yeah.
I created everything. Everything.
Yeah. Matt and then Pat.
Well, if you go back to one way to generalize Job's questions, hey, I've done nothing wrong and bad things are happening to me. God, you've messed up.
Right.
Like, you got this wrong, God.
Yeah.
God saying, I've got it all. I've got all this intricacy figured out. I've got the animals, all this stuff, the water cycle, all the things we talked about. I've got it figured out. The implication is, I've got you figured out, Job. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I think that's great. Pat?
Well, God let Adam name all the animals,
Mm-hmm.
and then he had dominion all of them.
Oh, bonus points for Pat. She landed on the same answer I did. So my answer to that particular question, my mind also went to Genesis 1 and verse 26. So God gave dominion over the animals to mankind. But even though we were given dominion over these animals, we did not design them. We do not sustain them. And so God is reminding Job of who truly rules all of creation. Jim, did you have your hand?
Well, and there was a reason behind everything God did.
Yeah.
And Job, you're not understanding
Mm-hmm.
all this, but yet you're questioning me on what I did.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we think about chapter 38, again, God was kind of talking about the creation of the planets, the heavens, the earth, things on a more cosmic scale, showing Job how he managed big things on a big, massive scale. And now he's brought it back down and he's talking about how he manages life on the earth with the different animals, right? And again, kind of following the order of creation a little bit of walking through first the earth and the heavens and the weather, and then moving into the animals and things like that. And what was one of the last things that he made? Man, right? And so to Matt's point, the implication being, if I've got all of these things under control that I told you about in Genesis, then I've got your life under control too, right? So let's see. How am I doing on time?
I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sitting here thinking, and I think I'm right in what I'm thinking. Adam named all of the animals. God created
Yeah.
them, but Adam named them all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my understanding of the way it reads. So let's see. So I don't know that we're going to get too far into chapter 40, but we can at least go over the first couple. Rick?
So basically, would you say, or could you say, this is just a thought I'm trying to formulate, but so God is telling Job, you don't understand or know all these things, how I did all this.
Right.
So of course you don't understand or know your own situation, right? Is that something we can derive from that as well?
That seems to be the lesson, right? Is that, Job is confused at why he's enduring what he's enduring.
Right.
Right? And there's this idea of justice and how God's justice is applied, right? And the ancient wisdom of the world says, if you do bad things, you get punished. If you do good things, you get rewarded, right? More or less. That's kind of the ancient wisdom. And Job is not fitting into that category. And Job is struggling to explain his position to his friends. All he can say is, I know that I'm innocent. I don't understand why these things are happening, and I'm reaching out to God for understanding, but I don't know why this is happening. And towards the end, he's demanding these answers from God, right? And to your point, God is showing Job all these things that he has under control. And essentially, Job just doesn't have the perspective to understand his own life, right? And if you notice, so far, has God told Job about any of the reasons of why he suffered just one of those things? Right? The loss of his children, the loss of his livestock, property, servants, the loss of his health. Has God answered a single one of those questions for Job? He hasn't, right?
And he doesn't.
And he doesn't, right? Yeah. All God does is show him these wonderful things in creation and say, I've got a handle on all these things. I'm managing all of this. And so the implication is, you need to trust me, right? Shirley, then Jim, then Rick.
I know we are not to question God, why things happen. There is a reason why things happen.
Well,
Lots of times we never get it together.
there's a reason that things happen, but I would say that we are to ask questions and seek answers from God in a respectful way, because at the end of the book, God actually praises Job for going to him and pouring his heart out to him. Now, demanding answers, that's a little different, right?
No, I didn't mean demanding. There has been some things that has happened in my life,
Mm-hmm.
even in my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like my father was taken away when I was 11.
Mm-hmm.
And you just don't understand that. And have I ever gotten an answer from God why that happened? No.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just something that does
Yeah.
happen. And what I'm saying is, Job is questioning God, and we shouldn't question him.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, there are going to be things in life that you'll never get answers to,
Right.
right? And God is encouraging Job with these sets of questions to simply trust him, right? Jim, you had your hand up next.
He wants Job to see that he is in control.
Right.
I made this. There was a reason why I did what I did,
Mm-hmm.
but I have it in control, and you need to trust me.
Right. Rick, you were next.
Yeah. Okay. I think what I was thinking too, it kind of implies you don't understand any of this, so why would you understand what you're going through?
Sure.
I think that's what I finally was boiling that down to.
Sure.
It just took a minute, so okay.
Yeah. Matt.
So on the questioning God, I guess my thoughts on that are, if you look at the Psalms,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times we like to look at the Psalms and praise God, like the song I sang about the
Yeah.
praise to give Jehovah. That's derived from the Psalms and it's praising God. But I think if you look at the Psalms, almost a third of them are laments, and the characteristic of the laments is like, "How long, O Lord, will you leave me?" Like what Job's saying,
Yeah.
questioning God, and not in a disrespectful way, but like,
Right.
God, I need help. I'm stuck. How long will I suffer like this? Why are you letting my enemies triumph over me? And when will you vindicate me? And those are questions. And I think those are examples that are good, but it's the right respect.
Yeah. And, it can feel really weird to think that. It's like when you read through those Psalms or the book of Lamentations, when you read through that for the first time, it can feel a little bit odd. Like people are questioning God. God's people are questioning him. That feels odd. But you have to look at the way that they're doing it. It's a very respectful way. It's not, God, you've messed up. It's not that. It's more along the lines of, God, I don't see what you see. Help me to understand, right? Or in the cases where it's not our place to understand, where, for example, Job never finds out the reasons that he went through this. God never sits Job down and says, well, you see, there was a day when all the sons of God came before me, and then Satan came among them, and we had this conversation. He doesn't explain that to Job. And there are times when we won't get that detail, right? Instead, in those times, we're to trust God and to rely on him and to remember these things, that he controls all these things, right? Now, you may entreat God, and you may get an answer, because there are times when God answers his people in different ways, right? So it's not that you can't ever get guidance from God, right? Pat?
I think Joseph is a good example of that.
Yes, I think so too. Joseph is a very good example. Yeah. Yeah, Elvin.
That is why God designed us
Mm-hmm.
free will.
Mm-hmm.
We have the free will to ask the question.
Right.
That's as far as it goes.
Right.
He is in charge.
Yep.
Whenever you get to the point where you think, and I think it might be, after Job a little bit on this, you're going through all this stuff. You're going through all these friends telling you all this stuff, and you're getting all this stuff built up in your head.
Yeah.
And you're kind of, but I am still in charge.
Right.
And he is making a point, and this is why he's going through all these other things. Like why I'm not ostrich and all this stuff. That's why he's going through all that, because he is letting Job know he is in charge.
Well,
No matter what you think.
if you notice, although he doesn't answer Job's specific questions of why he's enduring these things, God answers Job, right? He doesn't just ignore him or be silent. He speaks to him from the whirlwind, and he talks to him. It might not be the answer that Job was expecting, but he does leave him with something. He leaves him with wisdom. He leaves him with a lesson, right? So God answers Job in his own way. He does carry a relationship with Job. He cares about Job. And so he comes and he takes the time to address this righteous man and to help him through a period of extreme sorrow. Now, it probably wasn't in the way that Job was expecting, right? But he still does it. And so sometimes we're always, when we ask a question of God, sometimes we have a specific answer in mind that we're looking for. And that makes us blind to the answer that God gives us, and so that's something for us to be aware of, not to get too fixated on what our expectations are. Albert.
God is aware of all these things that Job is going to do.
Yeah.
God knows all this stuff. Job doesn't.
Right.
He's getting his point across. The only way that God can do it.
Right. Well, we're pretty much out of time for class, so we'll dive into chapter 40 next week. So go ahead and read through that. We're almost at the end of Job, and I know that the last two chapters are some of the most entertaining ones, right? I'm anticipating a lot of discussion on those ones. So go ahead and read through those in preparation for that. But as far as the invitation goes, if you'd like to turn with me over to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is speaking at the end of the chapter And we'll read verses 43 to 48. It's pretty fitting for today. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 43. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may prove yourselves to be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to shine, or he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even the tax collectors, do they not do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Even the Gentiles, do they not do the same? Therefore, you shall be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." So thinking about the rain, right? This is an applicable verse. Jesus is describing the rain, along with sunshine, as one of those blessings that he gives to all the world, right? Whether you are just or unjust, or righteous or unrighteous, there are some blessings that God gives to everyone. It's a gift freely given, right? The sun and the rain, things that in that time were good because they meant good crops, prosperity for you. Those things were given to everyone. And Jesus is mentioning these two blessings that are given to the world for a reason. Because he's trying to get people to love their enemies, right? He referred to the Old Testament. He said, you've heard that you're supposed to love your neighbor, right? But he wants them to take it a step further. He wants them to love their enemies and those who persecute you. And he uses God as an example. He shows how God does that very thing. He says that God sends these good blessings on the unrighteous, right? Well, what are the unrighteous? People who sin, right? Think about the terrible things that are said about God on a daily basis across the world, right? His name is slandered and blasphemed probably once a minute or more around the globe, right? Terrible things are said about God on a daily basis. And yet, God allows those people the same goodly blessings, the sunshine and the rain, to get them through the day. He gives those things freely. And why does he do that? Why does Jesus want us to follow that example? Well, he says that if we just love people who love us back, how is that something special? It's easy to love someone who loves you, right? It's very easy to love someone who's kind to you. Think about someone who's been really good to you in your life. It's really easy to like them, isn't it? But now think about someone who's been really mean to you or bad to you in your life. A lot harder to love them, to be kind back to them, right? Jesus is saying it's that hard thing that's praiseworthy, and that's what he wants you to do because God does it, because he does it. He uses the example of the Gentiles. Now, the Jews thought themselves to be special, right? The Gentiles, they weren't people that were important. They were bad, right? They weren't the chosen people. Obviously, Jesus loves them too, right? Else we wouldn't be here. Jesus was planning to spread his word to all the nations, right? That was always the plan. And so he's using the Gentiles as an example to the Jews, right? He's saying, the Gentiles even do this, right? They love people who love them, right? I thought you were better than them, right? Shouldn't you be doing this as well? But the message is that he wants us all to be this way. He says in verse 48, you shall be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, right? Perfected love. That's what Jesus wants us to shoot for. That's what he wants because that's the thing that he did. And he did it in the ultimate way, right? He came down and he gave his life for who? For just the Jews? No. For just the Gentiles? No. Just the people alive at his time? No. He did it for all those who would love and obey him, right? That was a reward that was freely given for anyone in the world to accept, just like the sun and the rain. I share this with you tonight to share the depth of love that God has for us, right? We've been studying in Job about this man who felt lost and alone, but he never was alone, and his God reached out to him. He loved him even when he was suffering, and so God still loves us no matter what we're going through. There are times when the hardships that we face in this life can tempt us to think that God has forgotten about us, or that maybe he doesn't love us anymore. And that's not the case. And so don't let those trials and tribulations that you face separate you from God. I started out this whole thing by talking about the rain because in our culture, we tend to think of rain as bad, right? It's not a fun thing. But let the rain tonight be a reminder of how God cares for everyone, about how he cares for you. And whatever you're going through, God is there for you. So if you have something that you need to get off your chest, or maybe you just need the prayers of the congregation to help you get through, we'd invite you to come forward and have a seat on the front, and we'll help you with it as best we can together while we stand and while we sing.